Yep.
I got you. I got it. Okay.
He likes
There's some on.
No. He likes pads.
He does not come around with pads.
Yeah, he came around with pads.
Really? Yeah, he.
In the process of spatial segregation, surveillance police advised me of Slow's activities of race codifying the race lineage to recreate the plantation ecologies past black and matching racial relations of black communities only emerged from history, say deconstruct that areas of landscape right to real black relations between the environment race and black and talks about back and relational community things remain certain savvy about conservation of black possibly but representing black university the geography of religious spatial segregation surveillance over police and practical black communities in and out of black people are erasing this space with their history into the historical social balance of one of the few groups so phenomenal big shape of black lives by black solution over time and no less reduced by the experience of the value source of those communities by writing racial economy college banks red boss is connected to land and red black culture connecting down to that possibility fungibility black culture structure by the black street culture reproduced by black culture eco group or not analysis they have social like city culture making it only seemingly second landscape or run by all lines of social things the reoccurring political paradigm management including basic active domination designed to maintain the captivity slavery control predictable fungible black fugitivity versus the fungibility is carbon material possibility to put back in the black imagination the kitchen whole king anti-coil landscape of anything will be back to sort of that and it was the full of power agency and then that was the fire reflected by what's sort of 15 domination by bodies across the beam and the second unpredictable better than figures landscape unpredictable movement by bodies by rigidity as far as the moving bodies that say unpredictable state of black because back line was impossible to do when imagination shut down if then we were strategy to making black people like fungible as a way to say as in nuances space of black movement to knowledge to represent the upper class of moment and something that's from the rebellion in general working class crowd occupied data that's also thinking of the unpredictable and floating black rebellion so strong being some power over black futures are representing this much more than informing representing these changeability commodity fungibility is a manifestation when you say black country the fungibility becomes an opportunity for black fugitivity as a carbon material possibility evidence of black fugitivity and fixation of the conditions of the whole deep these are the logic factor unique degradation intoxication of black geopolitical lands into the form of erosion exploitation road 19 oil as an organization about agriculture that is trying to degradation on intelligence as an example back over industries among most of the representation by communities rather than recreation to the housing worker shows having sedimentation points by constitution to feel by water pack growth over sedimentation of the classification country data economic social marginality of people's administrative facilities servitization demographic trying concentrated taxing the healthy capital trading the trying to college human geography the colonial periods of running at least shape their region share principal domination exploitation development private region water resource the ideology dominating grid and ownership the customer recognition for women in change of plantation industrial consequences is actually affecting waters and below population better towards the stage transfiguring fixed water and land through the constructing down space and forest by the planning of gas roasting to burn instead of various located in environmental shift of these rather than communities suburban mountain slavers of culture transfer landscape by white so the descendant of slave communities and inherent vulnerable structural land or the domination and restriction of the electrification on sort of vulnerable communities and self-fashion that individually black culture books ongoing legacy local communities efforts of self-creation resisting carry out the indigenous and also our way the other pagan in charge of the community started living in the plantation the landscape this has worked from self-yard relation that your primary grammar mass and connected to black social life and land water safe food limited source of the impact of the book of legacy mini search of challenging the inclusion of the future practice plotting it and enslaved by black communities the possibility for development good and certainty when negotiations landscape captivity domination by communities emerge engagement with the practice of place and alternate configuration land and water versus action and slave challenging the infrastructure commodification social control development why do these institutional recognition of black communities harms provide choice recycling into black political paradigms including looking at 18 spy and securing and instruction secular capitalism born in the communities of environmental harm digital conservation black communities well-being and readjusting injustice continue to normalize operation relation west burmese and self-related black communities injustice and eligible the government proceeding this future for the surrounding black and hydro government pipeline development on relations to the large absent considerations for the concept of disparity eligibilities resource of government and its authorities being coming to open the external rising possibility relation between those inside of the government and the racial capital false equation of the justice with liberal recognition of the difference must be rejected the racial bunch and condition on the form of differences around the legible political use of categories or racial bodies inside of the lands of racial capitals and liberals nationalists and hierarchies liberal offer recognition of racial wide authority of the last marginalization and people recognition precedents to struggle destruction meaning mobilization back in indigenous communities of Syrian power relationship translation black and indigenous political articulated and shared represented on the flow waste forms such as racial slurs such as black rose and face marks now recognizing EJ communities regulatory process the however, institutional EJ source evidence and reproduce language contaminated environment, racial bodies organized in the FC, the EVs refuse the demands of focus or mediation to destroy the impact of communities while occurring, offer inclusion of the disciplinary probation agencies so that they recognition that EJ communities refocus themselves on the celebrating people on orders be that persists by effects of and offer guiding communities by housing the warning and access of those being called government to act not just recognize thus we embrace fusion marine landscapes the social motive refugees corruption the social political system that thrives on black and the environmental exploitation marine landscapes as refugees corruption modes of space capture control black but in generate waste food shows are related to the process of refusal and say people can export temporal geographies to move flows fly escaping response as sort of generate plantation economies done about 20 US slave after that being services and social services outside that filter review and supplements offered. Alternate space actually the freedom both these make life marine landscapes on real chambers and environments, 2 marks and 2 unruly barbers and locked in cities was uncultivated lands away from the chosen and mystery found machine the place on the spirit of living one land off here, not those from the Jerry's and Mary TMC says it is a shift in mobility. Dreamscape before all mirror Jerry's controlling a minute of the same people's net. Also, for other shit mobility is propagated during the use of this spatial order saves. Shift plantation, cooling assets, and legal approaches that were bypassing identification, so knowledge structural lands with dynamic, also telling control back what about facility operation necessary to maintain. Teaching on these within mobility should discussing setting lands and dynamic process letting you through cloning neighborhoods and actually refusing crossal lands. Saves a lot of instead documents talking about rubbish field turning ways annoying and using plantations on the face of conflicting with the famous ideal. To make social space include not only places of knowledge, but movement spaces in your mind, for organizing and organizing documents here to form some mobility refugees also would need a space where private and public creators expressing the rest of the alternative communication versus planning domination, the sex of discussion, landscapes and drivers often fall into that mobility or sex users spend the nation learn mobility research places back people also any features sort of new third films archive or discuss the stories of illustrating rather than saying notices that like the drivers are doing the is like parts of place where back in the struggle here for as well the experience of knowledge and businesses like land and living so the song inspiration of black person in space and time and denounce 18 mass energetic refusal absent death less pretty common and led fled and separate skills over chain leaders that carry the fugitivity and bodies of pulse and black magic acts of phenomenology black moon and cyber modality for resistance of LSKTD other investors physical creatures and not versus or the to say great services addressing the constellation be a future the ways of physical women another case future figure ceiling with imagining class from all level structure of movement is our movement like fusion borders and then during also the season frame of silver rising including mass vision founding extraction and quoting acceptable expression black and saying original long as the trend that Martian scripting government the same also season also is one against one great future of escape from historical massive racial surveillance balance incentivized liberation research DSRBAB plasma stimulating tools that further practical and nature BHR teams to responsible translate communities with diversity outside best successful not generating nomination previous open debate account of circle that forcing teachers trying to consider what not sure it wasn't engaging or resolving environment household difference fugitive practice the rejection of rules to enforce their interpretation and cultivate this unreleased essential black survival in the space of key to question authority inherent in here's that governs the space of big vote after the rebirth rules bay 9 fugitive reference all non fugitive marks and disney and parting non pervasive and enforcing fundamental big sides of being to the repressive violation fugitive religion decapturing the non-consistent fugitive rule about this movement more select governance highlight the also made a little shipment to the rules and be running using against the allowing mind the system of girls and mobilize and service and units as a sort of ethical social. The role of judges to affirm fugitive states of education, Coles and Warren, 20 fugitive issues that wasted by which black people hurt to living among them as well as the land, member of the fugitive states, non-dash that not the direct rules as predominantly white class and other cultural parents and accessibility of fugitive educational states, responding also to great growth and persistent do that, as the center treatment fund also which what counts as knowledge of racial counts space schools is essential helping emerge for success.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
What does fugitivity look like in the context of the app?
What you mean fugitivity is the process through which we imagine how we protect water resources. That's
Sure,
the
so-
affirmation of the app, so I don't know what you mean in the context of the
Okay,
app.
so like what does that look like materially? What do we do?
The AF gives an historicity of Murinaj in the context of a resolution of water protection, material examples that are inspired from the Tunabon evidence in the Caribbean, and specifically like the black Seminoles in Florida who protected the Everglades through a fugitive ecological relationship were necessarily good and provided a kind of way of living that existed outside of colonial officials' purviews that kind of resolved the modes of exploitation we stare by.
Okay. The King evidence and the Roan evidence, so is the argument that management is the cause of toxification?
Argument is that toxification is produced from this anti-black tendency to exploit black spaces. Our argument via the King evidence, the article is talking about scopophilia, all these kind of theoretical words, but what it essentially means is just that literally white people will look at black spaces or the political structures will look at these black spaces and exploit them because it benefits them.
Okay. The Mercury evidence is every state-based policy bad.
Our argument is in the context of black people. Anti-blackness undergirds how politicians act, how they.
So I understand that part, but like inevitably there will be a TBA. This evidence says it's hacked as institutional recognition is bad. Is every state-based policy that's meant to
We
benefit?
don't have to win every state-based policy is bad. Our argument is that institutional recognition in the context of black people in water is bad.
What's institutional recognition?
The argument is that hypervisibility of Black in discussions are anti-Black. Obviously, this needs an example. The example's in the card. The EPA in 1996 created a new office that tried to resolve the exploitation that happened post the Clean Water Act in Black spaces. It didn't do any of that, and then Black people in Atlanta called them out for it, and they used fugitivity as an analytical orientation to rupture that, which proves that our politics is necessary for Black life to
So
call that things with the government.
I understand like the historical examples, but what part of this evidence do you think is predictive that all forms of institutional recognition are bad?
He literally just
Because-
told you.
No, you give me an example of.
I gave you an example. I just gave you an example in
I
the
need
context of
a
the topic.
predictive example.
You won't have a
You
more-
said one example from 1996. Do you have a predictive example?
I mean, examples like if you
We have
say that we
the
should
Rowan
clean
evidence
the
goes
water.
through the history
I
of
can't hear
Washington, the Chesapeake Bay area, the Anatomic and the Anacostia and Potomac River in those areas where Black people are exploited, which is a constant theme. The reason that they are exploited, the reason there's a desire to create degradation to the point of no return in those areas is because politicians and political structures are undergirded by an anti-Black economy.
Okay,
That's the
that
key
makes
difference.
Too off base.
We're still waiting on it, but ours always lags.
Yeah.
You like preemptively send another one. It usually comes together. It's really weird.
We're always the last one. Like ever.
Okay, I sent a second one just. Do all three judges have one?
I just got it.
I just got this.
All right, we're good.
Okay, anybody else?
First off, the tax was which cultivated hypothetical giant each of these conversations that United States shooters actually should not the policy entire mythological potential water resource requires that action mood to give national conversations where to ensure they can avail of every system of water resource but nature to impact one fairness force when you lose your nature means this game the opposite you can say share the resolution of base research and also discourage argument division ensure sensibility access to the action activity second this applies incentive as if it's along the interval resistant and opposition will like guns will continue transformed into election that destroys rigorous testing accuracy research skills and turns for accuracy recruits every intrinsic benefit to debate doctors denying debate provides preparation for argument debate to the capacity to employ strategies and action research for university can less provides greater depth of understanding without the guidance of topic avenues to research new election after UN section around the competitive policy debate content. And then it's for review research around the front doors makes a good outcomes ways to prevent sections who are not engaged until research into the topic. Even talking about to take action research needs to be considered the topic US section should for that to rather people support of no movements researching both sides of argument ideas to create advocates based on both sides that get the position can attack learning the nature of most also big to the right stance. Switch debates also offenses great through to abs skills and most reflexive version of the topic. Next off is the campaign council drive to accumulate condones of violence with national nuclear war for the good. 11 the threats to use violent conversion military bomb like a conversion to that's the company sees action at the council accumulation must be civil council and avoid that decision given out accumulate central rationality son of the hostile culture balance of issue religious towards nuclear warfare and violent national council with that. But their politics disconnect organized struggle, murderous shifting as communities from organized politics against capitalism into a bunch of what we thought of politics push structural likely that the capital advocacy and micro activities are more important than large scale organized movement that any business and politics from working people like politics and spectators. See spectators can play to be radical have to get their hands dirty funds given the down constituted the safety absolute ongoing as to future contributions and the possibility one what is registered are not around these program those activity community gas like the gas attempts to drown out forceful place for realized potential, no unrealized potential to be used content, struggle politics without organized forms, politics without organized form of the party's politics without politics of parties and complex analysis and revolution showing the capitalist system illusion and our individual aspect of what inherently what imminently conversion pluralities capital practices creating sharing to find a new mode to struggle like it scale and thereby cultivate the desire for collective desire realizing the communist arising get to work and cultivation of what we are in common. The alternative to embrace the communist arise align ourselves with global movements against capitalism and re-enter life force possible is revolution change Dean. And 12, countless whose rather choose communists as the lost rising features of boxing failed with which is the born working class, which especially communist trying to establish limits to read the least of the crazy communists, establish politics, space, and different lives of liberals and against capitalist conservation. United to block communists from consideration of lasting communist reversion of left again, becoming discourse of converse the same as majority culture and after people can consider the concept of the form of the legacy overlap. With this right view, capitalist competition, calling economic quality, application, and police violence, communist reversion, and political issue to avoid the communist rise and produce completion is for capitalism is not the only thing how communists rise in the field of possible revolution or crash change shape. There is all the new position challenge coming forward in possible and possible primary. In terms of political destruction, media specific local politics struggles to agenda the capitalist setting communists rise the precedent to abolish capitalism, create practical practices, institutional egalitarian cooperation directly putting in the hands of participants, collectivity, we're breaking with conditions of right to be more individualism and thing. And speak as part of a larger context subject. The case page vote negative on presumption. The impact of the one requires debaters and judges to retain their message. Debaters have lives outside debate, different rounds, and judges never take anything beyond a single debate. Only the risk that they incentivize more teams to double down and go for further approaches to which magnifies their offense. Ballots cannot prevent the material impacts of the one sites. Presumption to shape impact calculus exclusively impacts that can draw a causal connection to the solvency. Systems of power are not offensive because they don't solve any internal link. Now, past ecologies might have been anti-black, but they are not codified into the earth itself. The plurality of past failures producing states for protection, and only re-engaging with protection can change the failures of history. Complex 17. And it was used not even human mastery or representation and challenging sexualism, no with organization and current limitation of American issues to impair what the region is to in-person institutions to respond to force of expression to possibly use especially challenging the table to be listened to be used about the power of ideals and training. Rather than common change the plunge too large multifarious no single faith, say their group conforms in their community state vision advancing academic principle or corporate established for operations and state practices movements each other's bad hypothesis which are also recorded between by some figures and anti-African challenge for this movement. Inside American thought but they may not have all the answers to what is all under fragile capitalist world 7 billion was the big orientation which we see involved in the capitalist system which is particularly respond to planetary nation no movements currently play pursue connection possible condition movements it could impose demands on an institution from inside and outside at the same time sort of injury energy called contingencies are true history cyclical nature breaks with resistance to white supremacy and progress has been occurring Kelly 17 not every back response to white supremacy social formation may be construction docs not defined by ongoing laws election of the town church white slave but the US 511 community to make the use of give white supremacy too much credit the trees later to mass incarceration the same thing tonight the existence of distinct historical significant result of which is a situation which we call like reduced slavery responsible for cutting out two chapters slavery huge gap between dead and construction rise to post abuse to kind of possibility short with the same mass incarceration upward swing and again with the once again the states we don't need all having thinking white supremacies that change faces so powerful can't do anything white supremacy racial racial regimes always show themselves up because they're unstable systems get the impression that it's so powerful yes working to respond to opposition and fixed frame inherencies explaining environmental protection are ineffective and entrenched fossil fuel capitalism laughter 19 see the world the way that it is not it should be influenced many incredible abuse wills and locals more sale relates essentially due to openness and this is not possible if epistemological orientation continue reasonable reason not more that actually produce knowledge and epistemological link to continue able to license to do proper work and justice at the core of the raw character too not concept for research and also research double down to understand the political world is necessary if one wants to change so-called rigorous knowledge production living requires expanding these work systems and reducing the research numbers for free floating or outside political conditions physical deciding course of action structural balance course through society and company carbon emissions goals must name these anything lessons of politics showing up on structures the states being active most powerful life state and primary target all political activity centered on activist groups influenced by people think they target mechanisms power and its rival state action they have to come to see states by material regimes and instrumentalize individuals actors and political participation in hope and removing systems of oppression is good Rasmussen and then 20 equal participation is a possible and active efforts to change practices to organize the political figure of institution expansion of habits and attitudes not abstractions we are about to reproduce because habits of engaged by agency African Americans in development political participation that subvert the powers that be enslaved achieve freedom by remain acting themselves in terms of those that are not the master African Americans have imagined ends connected from fixed subject to be those of the agency disengagement from the structure domination and insights change the belief that circumstances and demands action to avoid problems rather than good rather than constituting pre-existing structures that can reproduce more inclusive formation each subject as essential to reform the political world legal institutions are inevitable for responding to the environment the only question is whether we can properly utilize them this generation is key we don't have characterization with intent President Wilson is these ideas of research type there is one thing to agree with we make it as part of the agreement that change the world one thing law be the forefront of the laws law forms innovation law presents agreement to redirect government's major societies covered through codes women and more child society legal government which division after relation each advocacy issue of concern legal government fails its citizens to death they legally consist of agencies with thousands of statutes and rights and government decision making is important to determine whether society will class and most environmental laws one justice special justice is different accountable to nature and to solution these laws of police upper repairs and if legislators do not sustain agencies therefore their own they serve rules societies our future dangerous hands that you have the process of democracy is the most important survival U.S. civil allowance and laws in the world merge cannot be the basis for a replacement of racial capitalism when universalized it devolves into plague platitudes middle 17 merge is not the escape from coercion robbery speeds and merge is being able to explain from individualized agriculture to revolution how could this be correct considering the majority of human productivity is not about freedom and all merge may offer a value of 80% of the Kennedy all-purpose political state of arguments about what freedom has been consider class policies organizing a large share for the social products and participation movement and consensus movement through distance I worry the evidence of the concept was statistic because of a medical could be extended to African people so which usually are rejecting parts of ideological kinds of alteration of body cognition and thus light and
saying Meritage is materially violent, the rest of society operates continuously as well. As it's going on, Johnson 15 gets right people alien household display, Georgetown free time, power, cultural labor rights, surveillance, it's subversive intellectuals, all the anti-council logic harbor, and over it sounds like a roller locking good time. What happens when you push, trying for real negative effects come to you. Make them filler, saturates a lot, shapes our experiences, feels like shit. You can't imagine your way out of racial capitalism. Subversive intellectualism is ignored and co-opted by capital Muhammad. 21, ecological cultural imagination, enjoy petty salvation, rapidly floating source of virtue. Jesus also reversing, there's no outside capital, facing my end within the world is delusion, desire by the way, again, working towards like velocity, orbits, and counts be other on the other side. When concept is benefits, job, and resources, exhausting, and personal benefits, equals to non-capital situation, fiat, and capital, they're nothing like capital evil. Continuing cost around cries that we need to imagine your way out of predicting and creative destruction enables the state of affairs is unsustainable. Future stories being canceled for this expulsion tragic. The reals the world died around them, no story is going to change. Any resistance is ignored. What happens if we use our imagination differently as a weapon against capital takes us that has been close.
Sentence here. Okay. I'm good. Okay. You good?
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna start on this Iverson card that everyone keeps taking from Michigan. It says debate provides preparation for participation in democracy. Is this mean that everyone has access to like democratic avenues?
Well, we think that all people can have some level of access to
Why is this historically true for Black communities in the context of water?
So there has been oppression that limits Black people from accessing institutions like the EPA. We've read pieces of evidence on the case page that says that that has been improving over time. The only way to make it improve further, though, is engaging in
I
trial.
mean, it's been improving over time, but shit like this continues to happen. Like these cards were read in 2017 years, obviously.
Well, like,
COVID response.
We don't
obviously.
go from slavery 100 years ago to immediately a completely egalitarian society. It's a process of fighting for like reparations and getting
How was the threshold for that fighting? Like,
Who
what?
starts- who-
well, it's a good thing to fight.
Who historically has started that fight and where have those fights happened?
Well, there's a bunch of actors that have fought for the political freedom of
So
Africa.
the USFG isn't the only actor that can influence how we discuss politics.
The USFG is the most powerful actor that can influence and can get
Okay,
rid of
yeah,
the
then
effects
I
of
guess we
racial-
can go to the moon card that says like protection established the state has a comparable duty to ensure the continued availability and existence of water resources. Why is that true or predictable in the context of Blackness and the status quo?
I'm sorry, what? Like predictable in the context of Blackness? What does that mean?
I mean, why is that predictable for Black scholars?
It's predictable for the debate community, which consists of everyone
Things
who
like
is
Flint,
involved.
Katrina, Chicago, Detroit, those don't have access
No,
to
the-
things like
the-
clean
the
water. How is their water
predictability-
protected?
So there's
They're
two separate.
I think the
unprotected
question
in the status quo. That's the argument. It
Yeah, but
lacks
things have been
state-based
getting
protection.
better. Right?
It lacks state-based protection. That's just a TBA.
Okay, yeah, right below that it talks about why like water rights decision ignore this duty, treating public water resources as a commodity reducible to absolute private ownership. Why is this not a double term for cap K?
Well, that's an example of an app. You can get rid of private water rights because it's ecologically better.
No, your definition of protection relies on viewing water as a resource, as a commodity reducible to absolute private
No. That
ownership.
is absolutely not true. Our definition is indicting a previous court decision that said that water rights were subject to private ownership. The protection in this context of the moon evidence says that the alternative to that is establishing that the state has a duty to protect water.
Okay, we can go to the cap K. How can capitalist accumulation, right, like exploitation, explain slaves being dumped overboard this song?
Well, one is that people, when they were bringing slaves to America, thought it would be, well, one, they had to survive to get there, which resource constraints on board meant they would throw people overboard. It was more profitable for them to
How
get
can
there.
it
some
explain the fact that
survived.
like mass incarceration is not economically viable for the U.S.?
What's the question?
How can it explain
It
why?
is economically, that's the reason, the justification for it, like prison labor, question mark?
It's case framework cap. So we know what everyone lists first. Serena John, I got it.
Yeah.
Is anyone not good? The normative base around water governments participates in the partial control of black aquatic landscapes. The movement to protect water from the making control nation obscures the racial conscience that trap blackness, environmental terror, fugitivity is a rupture to those racialized colonial anti-black landscapes that dominate spaces. That's all messy from the black settlers before to protect every race, agreed to solve the span of black fugitivity bodies of geographic policy and politics of opacity and protect surrounding cultures and people. That's beautiful. Several impacts that way. One is slow death plantation. Economies of black dehydration accelerates slow death most surveillance that produces saturated conditions for black communities. That's right. Second is eco-managerialist tendencies to monitoring and management of water quality delivered by anti-black desires of racialized communities and perpetuates biases and pathologized by black communities that creates degradation like in the Potomac and Intercoastal River. That's the right now. It's next to black fungibility, continual black movement, society, geography, excuse possibility for anti-black labor practices, the move buddy black special sustained white labor production. That's king of his presumption. One, no brown labor for constitutes material action. Make them expect financial cases before you assume you violate their standard. Second, sequence of discourse before shield up a shift was maroon orientation necessary for black flag. That's all messy evidence for stage previous presumption logic the epitome of colonization that produced a conquered notion of action response for rule literature as deviant, which is the worst form of scholarship. The colony evidence literally fills out. Says orientation failed, but never says those orientations have to be tied to policy, which is why the office key Kelly we literally view the consistency framework just in a different way, but then we'll put offense A's, white system just have to say that the evidence has come from a video online without the consent of Robin G. Color, any other black figures looked at by white debate coach, which shows the way black scholarship is made fungible under their models. The reason they should lose, especially when using this evidence, is based on why anti-blackness shouldn't be given priority and completely out of context if it's black. Marxist Bruce, the Walker evidence double turns with the odds about imagining futures. We also have outlined our course of action. The Rasmussen is wrong. That's Sullivan 17 black Americans instructions depending on the level of eliminates migration, providing to the most optimism of can be harmful weapon bars, image society, many officers of the levels within the setting of the anti-migration, worst migration, issue, liberation, by the police, psychological, to the presentation, anxiety, that harm, like, between high percentage surrounding last position, reaching to very more time with the bodies, versus the just the community over time racing killed. What this worst one is criminalization, colonialism, and management assumes that only politics can be a form of retribution, which you are going to impact our mills. And this one, we agree with the majority, absence our politics can offer a viable perspective. Second, only we can recognize that at the second level award for this car by acknowledging how limited human freedom is in the context of political retribution. Johnson is not the F1. We are in our politics of quitting the tribe, but the way we facilitate revolutionary strategies is necessarily valuable. We'll have it. This one culpability is about to hold back global for our white responses to them, but it's also solved by a resolution of eco-managerial 20 seconds later by what is he doing about emphasis says our politics exists outside of colonial officials for review. 3, literally impact on its flows out. It says what happens if we try to use our imagination differently? What new nightmares might we be able to machine? Those new nightmares are the politics of fugitivity that rupture the normal interpretation of politics framework debate. You came to this debate to apologize and exclude us. Your stylistic informants will always preclude us. The role of the judge is to affirm future space of education. 1, the one sees present debates where let's get the loss of black and buddy lines fight within activity predominantly navigated by white people. A, they're pluralistic modalities offered to interpret the accidents like hibiscus training by special fugitivity. The absence of placemaking method ruptures the bonds they try to be. Political structures can't solve any of our offense. Another colonial desire that creates a possibility for political change, which says the TVA, that's McCurry and Milligan. C, we meet the content of the resolution. D, a solution. Their only offense will be at the level of agency, which we will impact our next black success in the anti-black climate policy debates and extreme low, which proves the orientation of the balance should take into consideration the body being excluded. Next interpretation, the basement culture refused by spatialization, this space in favor of body literature. That's Mirage. 20. What's this supposed to be on whiteness terms of the university through using black as a pretty transparency to dodge articulation, black and rhetorical logic, this involves situation, communication, cursor, like the body space culture, and race, framing of cultural history, cultural identity, this style, taking the content to knowledge, performance, style, those psychological norms, practical, the white case of produce practical, response, things, given the practice, and place must be reproductive, judge, going with potting, collecting, archives, everyday black death, and trying ways to decide sides of the economy, the underscore into the communication research, and towards after relational models, realities, and all connected relations, and point permeates all research activities, and that benefits A, equal critical analysis, only are to create responsibility for 2 teams to produce critical space of resolutional objects, B, ethical subjectivity, our model, forces non-black people to ethically confront engage with content of future space of black people's terms. Next is a case of ways that firm fugitivity as a practice facility resolution for whiteness, non-black should not determine the rules of engagement for black people. Next is captivity, disability, preservation, principles of class perpetuates itself over the axiom of white anxiety and comfortability over the neutral states of debate, the produces cross-body black people, ensures them a nexus framing, aiding debate, union-based code game, incentivizing the infinite regression, operating worst forms of debate, improved by plant-based policies, preempting dissent, reading by new maps, nexus, natural limits, solves all your offense, limit on argumentation, critical scholarship, germane to the topics that can be leveraged in debate, nexus, permutation, neurotypicals, R's minus the USG, nexus, the model for states that discussions that reproduce co-option of environmental justice, discussion of policy recognition that never resolve racial violence, but ultimately operate on the mystification process that we have impacts for nexus, of discomfort that moves to make future taxes coherent, it's like debated through their stance, particularly limits leads to the question of movement building resistance because it isolates the key strategies revolutionaries will use prefer by the black capacity, which is debate around orientation, not specific proposals, returns class, next fungibility, descent models, and plantation-based economies of labor, intellectual property, and hyper-technical production of argumentation and research that reduces black folks to machines for this space. Nexus fairness, one procedural terms of debate that conduced by structural exclusion, black theoretical price, and debate in academia, traditional forms of research, universal notion of fairness, and racially coded to determine what procedure norms consider viable or which uniquely disadvantages black social that session on the middle 21 during a crisis. That was one procedure where the public will differ on the procedure notion just relies on the drip to frame the ethical decision methods called by how rapids such acknowledgement human difference addressing quantum of the physical difference by human binds social human difference provides the show no negative but symbols applies all systematic all equal and racial aspects constantly proposally affect the art dissipates the reality such as assuming how possible the black music for Christ only as an afterthought when the evidence shows a significant impact and don't activities the silence and systemic racism perpetuating and exacerbating structural violence towards black Americans nexus can't solve your office no reason why voting makes up cancer being read there and level 3 is unfair is good for not about fairness speaks on difference severe and totally to solve dogma Iverson literally says their class trained students engage in practice democracy which is separate from black mental control history of environmental violence. It just says that their class makes us better advocates, but we impact in those discussions, so they only become better advocates for anti-black discourse, also balance selves, research, and through value, particularly through community trends, as TSRB, which they have no counter evidence. The captivate framework, our interpretation, you should weigh the African preferred any other percent loads of arts, legal loose proliferate, undebatable with such competition, workers, non-social theory, well going that does not resolve extinction. After always, black social life and spirituality provides vital life, permutation, we achieve that y'all can overcome the least of the Africans, who about sex code, the debate proper, the preaching against fundamentally has no link and resolve all your offense. One, the King Evans voice, he provides best analysis for cyclical nature of capitalism, concept of black fungibility, we say drops and neurons for women, why anxiety that literally conditions the economy of labor in the first place because the neoliberal austerity politics and active racialized communities are rooting the economy of white vices and determine black communities are racially divided and surplus labor that structures of white capitalism, black people beneath their positive ruinous is a rupture of this economic mythology onto black people. Dean evidence is violently homogenized black resistance is not just individual but collective flight movement. Prove I heard an example of Milligan Evans talking about how communities engage in colonial rupture, not just individuals. Also, we'll make a homogenization of the stat to the all, which will apply here later. The link to merge office is necessary for black lives to socially to imagine sociality outside registered for embeddment worthless. They said racial capitalism codifies black sites. That's Winston 21 maroon geographies. Manifested geography like difficult to remain in the symbol for including plantation comics the worth of chronological capitalism carrying the maroon college black uses lens critical basis for reflecting racial capitalism that enable words to stop from beyond the confines of plantation such as capacity to generate new life like the against restriction of capitalism racial capitalism the framing issue. They have to win that black people using flight as a politics is necessarily bad for the alternative, which they won't have card one on next reputation development and that benefits future black art plenty and action rejects the alternative static conspiracy in favor of policy refusal that generates black industry key internal to mass mobilization race is necessary for class analysis that's Sojourner 17. It's go back to political government plantation based economies where rebuses black people society control black by revelation planning and action produced demonstrate the indicated facade state power level for MCU refusal set solutions based on black rifle action provides path for the looting space black people show paradigm central contemporary capitalism back to place local space for black rights tradition the Indian of local guarding practice fully grasp limitation local state projects under condition of capitalist globalization that intensified hierarchy reduce somewhere to be able to exercise industry has been servants army power social the action taken by black people structure of 18 with social arrangement that made some serious amount of black rights means to grasp the complexities relationship we focus on black radical action the conclusion to the constraints of contemporary capitalism the next extinction to be proper one all life matters capitalism assumes universal proximity death mystifies mundane violence second is it's a non-starter free when the racial conscious accelerate black efforts makes extinction and about the level of ecological disaster which we want to see right at its next is case also only the act conviction a world without capitalism through black relations and maroonish void of economic benefits the alternative proper one is the modernization is that they're all assumed subject to all race workers strategies based on trades off of the ability to rupture capitalism reproduces a class race binary that assumes what's the difference which between the two which makes the alternative A paternally parasitic towards different modes of study sociality B makes intersectionality impossible limiting capacity for all solvency second is all case their revolutionary tendencies assume our phenomenologies are formed in action or lack real purpose that which actively pathologize their blocking time in the space next is mastery just have the vertical structure and dense laws of mastery that assume domination power creating differential by system in the party and who deserves more recognition over others which maintains status quo paradigms deliberately taming the other. I didn't read the evidence.
Yeah, real quick, can you just walk me through the 4 subpoints for the first reason?
One is the one sees presence changes how we orient debate into a maroon landscape that allows for black mobility and lines of flight within an activity predominantly navigated by white people. The A subpoint was the pluralistic modalities often enact themselves under an anti-black hubris of contestation that constrains black expression fugitivity. Next is like the political structures can't solve our offense. And then
C and D.
we meet the content of resolution.
And D.
Your only office will be at the level where you see which one you pick.
Okay, natural limit, what is it?
Our argument is that there's a limit to the critical arguments that have been read in the debate.
There's like a finite limit of research that exists?
There's a finite limit of types of arguments from critical teams that are in debate. That's like why you see like the same themes.
Okay, but that's like an incredibly large research base.
It's
and literature
well,
base,
our
right?
argument is that no, because like the natural limit is an argument that like critical clash provides the possibility to engage with all those themes. I.e., like when the negative faces an optimism act, you could read pessimism. If the act is kind of a mix between optimism and pessimism, you could read a flinch argument. If it's pessimism, you read optimism, right? It's like there's like types of limits on like what the centralized themes of those discussions are that enable the possibility for clash. The problem is that you preclude those things because you have a desire to be anti-black and not engage in those discussions.
Well, hold on, that's a different thing. Why does the affirmative team being tied to a clan mean that we can't engage in critical research or like that type of like?
It's a question of methodology. Our argument is that fugitivity is an embodied politics, a commitment from black people, for black people, to resolve some sort of racialized violence that we have said is good. Impossible because the McCreary-Milligan evidence, which will have no counter evidence to, that is specific to fugitivity, talks about why institutional recognition of environmental justice discourse leads to more exploitation, which I gave an example of in Atlanta, which you have no counterexample to in the block, which should characterize the judge's understanding of what it means to institutionalize those
We haven't
discussions.
gotten there yet. The argument about like how on the like critical analysis part about how your interpretation fosters critical analysis, what is the definition of like a methodology or that like how do you determine what is included versus excluded in that world?
Our argument is that the app has to be germane to the question of water protection. Ecological reading of the resolution, which is the debate in ecology, limits content, but does not include style. Like our argument is that like apps should not just stand up and just like read whatever they want, right? But they should be germane to the content of the resolution. The app itself is a forwarding of that interpretation and proves there's a possibility for that to happen to provide clash. Because literally no card in the app makes sense without the topic.
Well, you be able to tell me what the flexibility just said is, that's the only word it's like.
So, is this the kind of competition that was and he has argued with it?
Flexibility just said, that's the word, something.
Yeah, that's the shadow.
There's
It's on
I
the,
don't see that.
go to HSM.
So I'll be back in a sec.
Okay.
Yeah, we have it now.
Just make sure.
You want food?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you will.
I was wondering where these were. Movies all day. There's movies all day.
Shut yours off. Okay.
Really
It's like a labor argument that like force us to produce more for the space of being black.
I'm glad it was.
Peter,
Second.
Peter, you give me more.
Yeah.
Tuesday.
Okay, stop up at 4 or
Actually,
we'll set up.
we can do this second. Or third.
Okay, should have passed this. I'm not even.
Did you just also the order listed?
Yeah.
You're ready now.
Yeah.
Okay, the cards are set, and I probably won't mention the last two. Or just.
Securities and cards.
Yeah.
I still have.
Yeah. Are all the judges good?
We're ready.
Yeah,
I
you're
don't
good.
know. Let me quit or restart Outlook. case.
Yeah, they're in the, I'll just copy paste them from the body. I don't know those.
You got it.
I just got it.
I got it too.
Okay, cool. Is that very good? Top law was over the resolution through an instrumental defense of protection water resources over course of the high level implementation of a plan through the federal government should set Erickson and Moon evidence framing issue for the rest of the flows of the two states described through the blocks the top speed, which means if I miss it with the argument again, you should our answers. They say rule of the ballot, the rules and judges to vote for the team. You know, the better debating the rules of ballot is communication. They communicate that position is however their determination is self-serving links to fairness offer below. Cool and warrants evidence substantiates the rule of the ballot, but it's wrong. First, is it nothing about voting up and death yourself to creating fugitive speeches. Judges go on to look for policy as that their model would say are bad. The role of the judge is a form of feel-good poll. It can be sound nice in the moment, but it's ultimately negated by the structured debate. Second is switch sides laws. Think about affirming for rooted NPR. Our final says racial counters facing any more than what you could do on the net. Third is the fugitive speeches can be formed from going to the tournaments, talking to people, reading books, watching YouTube videos, etc. Their evidence does not contain the combination keyword which frames the debate. Four is the connecting structure of fairness and ballot, makes ballot punchable and tied to individual wins and losses. The role of the ballot subways will mostly be answered on the line by line, but they do not meet the content of the resolution. They are not water protection, but USFG after the only definitions for this to be. The counter termination to me, that's an ecology has zero stable definitions, not writing resolution wording, so you should interpret it as including every affirmative under the sun. It answers both of their standards. It does not foster critical analysis because we can still break policy after made water protection. Teams can still look for framework to stay good and stay good into their self. There's three distats. First is limits as an interpretable stasis. They reinforce an impossible research products for a case that everyone is going to choose their own adventure, which has two implications. A is we cannot guarantee the education of what is the asset in or testing. B is that teams always spend more hours working on T-box having engaging in valuable topic education or active strategy. Second is the ground said USFG reforms the season. Greatest have linked accountable competition. They manipulate the balance of practice awards and the concessionary strategies. Third is particularly the resolution as a stasis is the only viable model of the topic and predictable stasis for preseason and pre-tournament preparation. The next argument is the case that way, so I'm going to do the fairness over here to be is again winners and losers speech time brackets that over guarantee fairness essentially impact without it. The outcome is the total impact of topic distribution activity of the irrecoverable research students inserting all forms of engagement. Clear limits on the topic ensure that debates continue as it turns their offense. They preclude testing and force out discussions, which is a functional solid teaching us any in-round benefit of their model and unlimiting for burnout and exhaustion of facing undue burdens on debaters and forcing a trade-off in our everyday lives. Time in school with friends and family should not come at the expense of an unfair activity. There are four subsequent previous issues. One is case cannot outweigh. We should value T prior. It's a procedural gateway that also the one you should have been read. Second is to presume a job athletes are false. They offer no clear omnic contested. Third is the ballot pick. You can deem the actual and civil neck to remedy procedural unfairness in this debate. Four is the individual based team stopping when you lose at the game we internalize process as a technical player rather than doing the opposing view. There's an accidental exclusion impact only fairness reserves equally for all individuals to participate. Often topic guardrails for leaders who lack energy or resources cannot engage in the activity. It's inherently exclusionary, reinforces negative power structures. The model gets co-opted by powers like GBN and MBA. You can spend thousands on new coaching and new obscure leadership to make every known to me. There are several specific links which means the ballot in this round is key. First is irrefutability. Subway A is not a limit to the block. B is advocacy and truism. The thesis of the one is that a politics of black imagination is good and status quo protection in water is bad and racist. At their core, those are not controversial claims. In order to rejoin the negative so possibly is mansion, which is not only unethical but to actually actively teaches this bad skills, which leave impact turned below, and it turns any benefit to reading the one in a congruent space. Second is shiftiness. The one lacks a well-defined actor or advocacy, which makes abstraction for actually the net. This should be decide on a whim without a one links or this work next week to our strategy by very different normative statement in the one with zero constraint. This means that the inevitable argument that we can present competing advocacies to solve their impact and that is sufficient ground is wrong because the lack of a stable advocacy frames all functional limits and it guarantees that two air will always be the front against any advocacy that we go for. They say that the case that ways because not black people should not determine the rules of the game. We do not determine the rules of the game. Your peers, not tyrants. We have purported an ideal model of our last year asset. If they do it successfully, you should obviously vote affirmative. Procedural fairness always their offense. One is that only our model remedies or impacts the NFL is not so structural inequities, but voting neg just so violations of procedural structural fairness in this round. Second is that their model is bad, protecting structural fairness and balance makes all tangible, which I did above. Third is accessibility, which is the exhibitionism that I did above. They say debate as a game is bad, we're impact turning it. Obviously, debate is a game just factually, and doing it as one is not intrinsic to our interpretation, but rather represents the common consensus and actions that the community takes at large. So Piaget, all of the one in our answers we cross the code. First, they link to this. Definitionally, Piaget is just a thought process about whether something ought to occur. The one he also advocated in political strategy. Second is that our model doesn't force them to re-entrench state power. Topical mechanisms that sabotage the state, which we'll get to in a second. Third is that there's no politics of recognition. Using the state as a tool for policy making can undermine its legitimacy. And even 10. Making demands of the state is more strategy, social movements, radical moves, make demands and not work within the state or reaffirm its legitimacy, demands to be federal position outside the political order, the impression of legitimacy, even sovereignty of the state by holding inconsistencies. They say the flexibility is that we do not force you to labor for us. We've offered potential TVAs below. There's no computer briefing by its worst with reading an app without a plan, then reading an app with a plan. The little evidence is not about debate, it's about CDC guidelines. There's zero obligation in this context and vote when that black people are physically disadvantaged from defending a plan, which we'll get to in a second. Fairness is not racially coded, it is good forever and as for the solution said that I did above. They say that unfairness is good. Wait, actually, they say that chaos are inevitable. It doesn't matter. The only remedy is the procedural unfairness in this debate, i.e., if they acted unfairly here, you can vote negative, even if they're inevitable. In other rounds, they say unfairness is good for black people. One, this cannot be true in a debate where they expect to win. If deliberation was impossible because of socialization, then the act and then the judge would not flow or interpret their argument. Second is that structural inequities are even resolved by the ballot. Above, third is the saying that we should vote for black people. A fact is the meaning of debate. Some reciprocal fairness is volatile because it guarantees a challenge for teams that proceed and an incentive to research and improve for those that don't. Four is that fairness benefits everyone. This argument is a fundamental contradiction because they rely on fairness norms in this space too. They follow speech types and expect you to follow debate. We will concede that the judges should flow and vote on top arguments and agreed with those standards. So I don't know what's wrong with one more. Five is that their model makes the ballot a mechanism for white judges to externalize feel a full sense of accomplishment without materially changing hegemonic structures in debate. Now, switch side, or actually, they say that they cannot accept that anti-black class is bad. We're not going for class, and we'll run it to be because it's same subjectivity. It's not intrinsic to our model. They say it's predictable through common sense. No, it doesn't. The resolution guides predictability, which is about. Switch side of it solves. One is that we are bad at changing our minds. Training to be skeptical makes us better decision makers at the margins because you don't just kind of vertically release off the bat. Only reading the app on the neck access it via class rather than unchallenged dialogue. Second is timing. It's psychology 101. If arguments are related to a well-researched topic, they're easier to process and help revise one's mindset. Third is advocacy skills. If they win that debate shapes subjectivity, then you should vote negative because under their model, activists are unable to react absent an ability to actualize their arguments to different strategies. Switch side fosters having forcing the active advice to test their model under varying circumstances. Now, the TVA. This is the important part of the debate because it stacks up all of their solution topics and inevitable impacts framing in the 2ER. Framing issue for the 2ER is not the framing issue for the TVA is that it does not have to solve the whole app. What are your objections are negative ground make their model reciprocal? There are two. One is that the USFG should abolish prisons because they pollute water supply. Second is that the USFG should increase its public trust protection of water resources in the United States. Both solve. The one you see road evidence as exploitation and return possibility a result of racial capitalism that both of the above access inroads to. It says quote black communities rely on rivers for recreation, food and housing, and securing access to those things is necessary to reverse structural balance. Their answer is going to be the Mercury evidence, but I will be very clear here. Mercury is not an empirical record or a predictive statement, but rather or an overarching theory of power. You should think back to Antonio's examples in what is the process and think about how us could target mismanagement of water in places like Seattle, Atlanta, or even Flint or Newark, which obviously proves that these structures are not immutable, which also John will talk about in the webinar. Abolition falls for Nero. 21. EP is not equivalent to precedent in environmental justice, presented documented contaminated drinking water smell, respiratory scan, downstream touch, comments on bad police and presence on abandoned rice, toxic mistakes, and military bases, population less unfair, to black urges, grassroots organizations to advocate and improve our organizations. The PDD solves if you blankly that allows for insertion of marine pedagogies under the basis that corporations are engaging in razor and responsibility through violent resource production in the scope of sound. 21. Critical principles to be part of their introduction as an implicit studying to radical lawyers and organizers who transcending hegemonic liberalism is a core characteristic and adoption which citizen-free organizations can determine the nature of the doctrine. This would bring to transform the doctrine towards post-liberalism. So it could be adopted simultaneously further national. I'm just merging it post. Okay. I'm good for doctors.
Alright. You good?
Yeah.
Alright. Since the TVA seems to be very important to you, let's go to the movement evidence. It says that, quote, making such demands does not necessarily mean working with the state or reaffirming its legitimacy. On the contrary, demands are made from a position outside the political order, and they often exceed the question of implementation or this or that specific measure. Why is that not the affirmative?
Well, it's not the affirmative, obviously, because you've not defended politics as a starting point, which the Newman evidence says is
Why is
key.
that true?
But
Because the Newman evidence says that these demands are not made
A
within
line
the
from your
political order,
evidence
but
in the
from
one
the
AC is that the starting point cannot be political emancipation. So you obviously do not meet this. The Newman evidence says that we can work with the state in order without reaffirming its
Yeah, but it says
legitimacy
that
as
those
a whole.
demands are made from a position outside the political
Yeah.
order and exceed the question of implementation
This
of
is-
this or that
sure.
specific measure.
This is going to pair really well with the Bernero evidence that I just read. The last line of the evidence says that this could be done by, or urged by grassroots organizations in order to advocate improved environmental conditions. They can partner with organizations below the state in order to do things that are good coming from the
What
state.
is the negative thing fugitivity is?
What I mean, I asked you in context of the one you see and you gave me a definition. Like, I think in the context of this debate or the rule of the ballot, it's creating racial counter spaces. Is that correct?
Well, I'm asking you a question of what you think fugitivity is.
I don't know
What does
what
it look like?
fugitivity, like who does fugitivity. Like, I don't know. As
What piece of evidence do you have that says fugitivity, the process of the integral process of reimagining the black fanciful politics that we have said are good, be it the when I see Omelski evidence, are produced from the TVA?
I don't think that that's the burden for winning TVA solvency
Right,
because
the
we run
burden is to
evidence.
win. Yeah, let's say it's like 0.001. I just need a card that says maroonage is cool and we can do it through a policy.
We don't have to read the words of the one AC read in our TVA evidence, but the stump
Why?
evidence is very
Given that the
specific.
creative evidence is the context of the act and refutes your claim that there's a political probability of
No,
resolution.
it doesn't, but the stump evidence is very specific that says that other like strategies can be
Right,
incorporated into criminal justice.
White guilt, what's the appearance?
White guilt, like judges.
Yeah, like you made an argument that like
Well, judges, I mean, I don't know how judges feel when they vote negative.
so then why is your white guilt? No, your argument is that like when they vote after they like feel some sort of guilt and like as if they resolve
Well,
something.
I'm just saying, so like the one, you just told judges that they can form racial counter spaces by voting affirmative.
We've said the role of
obviously-
judge in this debate is to affirm racial counter spaces. I'm confused as to
Sure.
like
So-
what's the warrant for why like affirming racial counter spaces in this debate makes judges complacent.
Well, it's not that it makes judges complacent,
That's
but
the
rather
argument
we
you
have
had in the
solvency
20
takeout.
that it like stops them from
So-
like trying to resolve structural violence.
It's not that it stops them from resolving structural violence, it just doesn't do anything. Like that's paired with the solvency takeout
Right, so it's
above
how it
to your
doesn't
model.
solve.
And
Cool.
second is that it allows them to externalize.
All right, last question. What's the purpose of the debate?
Well, we think that debate is a game, and so like it's fun.
So
Like, it's
it's
fun to
just
play.
fun. Like, what's the purpose of the content over like political discussions and
I-
politics and policy?
We don't
proposals?
think
Why are
that
they- if they're not externally valuable, what does your model do for Black people?
we think that Black people should be able to play the game of debate and have fun.
Oh, okay.
Cap case.
Wait, are there cars?
Yeah.
I might as well just preemptively ask you that.
Okay. I'll send you a couple.
John, did you receive it?
Yeah, I sent two of them.
I just got it. Use it.
I would. Both of y'all.
Yeah.
All three judges. Concede the permutation where like going for the criticism. I'm going to answer the three impacts at the top of the case overview. First, they say that the claim resolves slow death or first is only resolved by all of our offense. I'm going to explain a lot of this later on presumption, but the act makes it so much worse will be explained below. However, they have no capacity to solve slow death. The anti-black racism that exists in debate is caused by a confluence of factors which the act has no ability to solve. Simply signing a valid affirmative is not going to resolve the death that is caused, and the psychological violence is caused by anti-black racism. Second, they say eco-managerialism. This is absolutely not resolved by the affirmative. There is zero chance of them resolving this. First is that there is absolutely no spillover, as we explained in a second. And secondly is that they have no method to solve eco-managerialism.
endorsing corporations are still allowed to pollute in a world where we go out and revolutionize to try to protect the environment, which will lastly is fungibility. They say that the plan is necessary practices in order to challenge it. However, that doesn't mean that it gets exported from round to round, which is not portable now. You should vote negative on presumption. They have no impact they can resolve through just simply signing your ballot through the 1AC. You should only vote for impacts that can draw causal connection to resolvency, which means the framework outweighs. There is zero chance the debate sheet subject to stage subject to abuse without live side debate, judge different rounds, and nothing gets exported. Now they say that there is no broad line for voting on presumption. However, yes, there is. The 1AC has to have an intrinsic impact, which is all by voting affirmative, which is the consequence of not endorsing a plan text. All empirics are examples, and all of the empirics and examples that they say are not a result of the 1AC, nor you signing your ballot affirmative leg. Next, they say that it is necessary for black survivability. However, the person that is not solved by a judge ballot, you might endorse their method, but it does not resolve any material impact just by signing the ballot. Second is that there are many things that reduce anti-blackness in debate, but the affirmative does not solve any of those things. Last is they say that it is worse, and they say that not voting affirmative results in worse anti-black racism, which was impacted out on the framework debate about how it is worse. Now they have dropped that presumption should come first. You should exclusively weigh impacts you can draw a causal connection to solvency, which is only resolved by framework. Now, I'll extend some of the disads. I'm only extending defense from the first disadvantage, and that is political hope as possible. First is the Kelly evidence. There are cyclical history of anti-black racism coming back and back, but there are democratic instances of possibility in between each of those. To treat Jim Crow slavery, mass incarceration as the same thing denies that there is historical progress working between those instances of repression in order to resolve them, which means that progress is getting better. Secondly is the Rasmussen evidence. The defense part of this is that democratic institutions are accessible to black individuals. We have to try all of the past empirics of environmental protection failing are reasons why the affirmative should endorse a plan and a mechanism to resolve those things. Just because it has been bad in the past is not predictive for the future. They say that we're misrepresenting black scholarship through the Kelly evidence. You make this argument against us every time. It makes no sense. The entire conversation that Kelly has is uploadable to YouTube, and none of it was cut out of context because his entire line of conversation is cut in the piece of evidence. Next, Sullivan evidence. There's Sullivan evidence about battle. Non-resolution research check the argument of the team. The Sullivan evidence about battle fatigue is based on three sources. First is a lifestyle magazine with no qualifications. Another is a news article from the Boston Globe. We'll insert their passage in footnotes. The income is comparatively the biggest factor that their study found, which proved that it is not entrenched myth at all. In 12, half the people below Hope Ribbon annual household income less than $30,000 annual household income significantly less than NEE is Rachel. Microaggression accounts for 64% low social problems for net 11.9%. It concludes negative hope resolves the problem of racial battle fatigue. Optimism turns case myth at all. In 12, hope is healthy with a realistic assessment of experience, realistic offers and avenues for coping. We're not suggesting a negative self-fulfilling prophecy that racial socialization will place the people reducing stress and low. Hope African American minorities will recognize racial discrimination and identifies as develop counter strategies. Now, the second disadvantage is that policymaking is good. There are two drop piece level claims of this argument. The first is that state systems are structurally inevitable. There is two implications of this. The first is that maroonage can only ever cope with the violence that fossil fuel corporations or the state creates. We have to infiltrate ourselves in order to prevent them from causing violence in the future. Secondly, is that states will push back against any exportation of the 1AC past this debate. We are not going to become revolutionaries, but even if we do and try to export the strategy of the 1AC, it can only result in more violence because of crackdowns, as well as corporations continue that pollution. Second is that climate change results in extinction. We only have so much time. The wood evidence is we have to infiltrate the level of bureaucracy in order to avoid extinction. Tipping points are coming out in the future, which means it is try or die in order to engage with the political. They have no capacity to solve this argument. It turns racial violence into the most extreme form of structural oppression. Williams, in 21 structural violence better response to the ground inequality flow. From my methods have clean air, water forms of the national land, strong polluted finding enough food, water cost effective for our argument of balance, GHG, food for our with waste and the cleansing because crops lost and misery, heritage, religious, people killing house, graduate slow. Balance goes up to that structure, dispersed across time, stage, created by generations of privileged people. It is selfish monsters, and there is a life of floyd event, but also community quality conversations instead of diplomacy or repression goes into criminal ruling class expropriating the globe. The argument that the 1ER is going to make is that it is not the impact that the 1EC tries to solve. I mean, we have no internal link or link to this argument. However, if this debate is a question of methodologies, endorsing ours is better because it results in solving ecological devastation through engaging with political structures. Endorsing the 1EC would disagree with that, which is a link to it. Now, lastly, I'm going to extend a little bit of defense from the third dissent of the 1EC. They're arguing about the Muhammad evidence flowing out is wrong. It says that imagining the revolutionary spaces outside of the state cannot resolve the violence of racial capitalism. There's a couple of implications. First is that nobody becomes revolutionaries because of the act. None of us are going to go out and enact the affirmative in protest or protect the Everglades like their empiric sites. Secondly is that this argument does not flow out. The 1EC imagines alternative communities and revolutionaries that they do not create by voting affirmative outside of the debate, which do not solve anything as per Muhammad evidence. It is like cruel optimism to like imagine an outside world of capitalism without taking steps to enact.
I have not.
was like, might as well have women village too. No reason, just. It's reasonable.
Hasty. Is there a doctor? There's not.
Traditional forms of water governance rely on organic by coding license or replicating system should be content that never protect our models and that's the clear million source of participation laws mastery repeat the police surveillance cultural control admin try to reach the three impacts low debt communities and flexibilities that way and link to their opposite source terminal effective fairness or clash on the boundaries of worst advocates of logic matter management control and every form of speech we don't have to solve every impact but our arguments we have to have the face of these things back utility is the only best strategy features of these necessary episode of the liberal water relation now methodologies on most based on exactly aspirations to arrive here that produce alternative ways of knowing and using the reasons contained in no presumption first they drop the link turn the cap gate zero reason why we don't get custom block we solve these things in structural balance the permutation value radical planning action that solve results take dragon crack on the verticalization back into the revolution that's the social narrative they drop the cave presumption that this logic captain that once they shift the goalpost was material less to manage like imagination they drop that we don't have to slow the future theorization is a good strategy to make but we also do things like the ballot which will be on the ballot time frame for climate change isn't solved by because they don't get the skills and education necessary to solve fast enough the law and ethical arguments we've done factor this epistemological laws and management control they design to maintain captivity or by imagination which fugitivity a theoretical practice for escaping the evidence they concede as reason reject the argument argument so crossed off before but also its ahistorical Jim Crow did not come about because of black democratic party gains and empirical segregation occurred before during and after black electoral political gains this is not 25 years democratic possibility instead of 25 years of informed narrow white terrorism like KKK or white knights filter all the legal questions through million evidence which it wasn't responded to in the two evidence Wednesday or the one I was just postured about but paradigms and instituted action representations of false equivalence suggesting land and the toxic flow of wastewater is set it's ceaseless that the wheels of liberalism turn out EPA guidelines for regulatory procedures which impact terms of TVA set for violence and racial association struggle for the procedural and general language of liberal reform and resilience and everything that failed attempts to define black success and constitution definitive evidence of framework legal recognition serves to reach and explanatory authority of whiteness reflecting state-based rubric that always demonizes blackness which turns the rescue sentence because it can see sequentially issue topicality for a role of judges to refer to states education which puts priority in blackness as it can't create counter states it's not an argument black people if they prove that argument is that they should be protected second it's not none of their offense about societal targets apply a role of judges about their own particular in the conflict framework also their role of judges aid arbitrary and there's no explanation of what it means to evaluate those things debate is not a game but an ecology there's no reason why definitions are necessary for political class but allowing and it's also means back about allowing to be debated as ecology means debate as a personal ecology reading of the rest that elevates ethics over things like fairness and black significates how we calculate what those debates are considered fair in the first place and how we relate to one another what's benefits of preserving activities to avoid scholarly difference. We meet our discussions or germane to the resolution more than things like fucking Maui or Columbia River Treaty. It's literally central to the topic. Their assumption that we are is pathological, which is obviously bad. And they drop the fungibility, decided into it. See that they literally asked about during 2NC prep their model, force black people that become machines in the space of debate, which makes blackness a commodity for preservation. The game they say is valuable chaos and inevitable through the interpretation that God doesn't solve their offensive means to minimize their impact. They can't say they question on models and they go for fairness in rounds, so it's either a link to deputization or pathology, where they deputize you with the prospect of the loss of fairness, or they don't solve their impact after limit solves predictable enemy machines that are reasonably predictable. They also don't solve already infinite after on topic of abused by big teams that span time water protection after search. They sell the meanings of prosecutor notes. They could engage just case of liberal recognition, this of any sort of limitation, including start price like Africa's cap cycle to Lewis, which is given 2 decades of Ivy class to decide first the management test as which the laws from master they control the laws binding to static from resistance law solely to one side is impact of captivity, second false promise fighting when they reaffirm against or negative always the way infinite maximum impact against the case makes sort of negation impossible until starts logic is relevant, which kills black advocacy souls in the first place to TVA versus silence. To base about faith and cross-cutting with multiple foreclosed entities makes debate about the plan text second to recognition, which is ultimately clear Milligan and stuff done on case file abolishing criticism literally extra and FXT under their interpretation would prove that they're not predictable or limited in the first place. The second one links liberal recognition, self-fairness, drop black success is the all-time low because of anti-black climate and debate is a framing issue that proves mythology outweighs all their offense and their only answer is seven shown is not about debate, which is one not true. It's about procedural fairness in the terms of procedure. They're presumed neutral states rest on procedural terms that are conditioned by anti-vax, codified racial education, not value, which creates white hegemony that allows them to decipher the wood. They presume that for full engagement creates logic with the DVNC that always labels things as anti-vax, which go back to the end. They also drop the structural advantages. Fans like that, having worked twice as hard to prove arguments anyways. The filter do things like you mean it's not fairness is bad, but the way in which weaponizes it also doesn't have to solve unfairness, but continual desirability of those things in the first place. They say it's just about this round, but it incentivizes teams to find those ways. The ballot pick to use serving proves the ballot is good for holding teams accountable, causing reflection on environmental sustaining hospital difference is the only currency that's empirically supported by the success of things like Google United Crowds, which led to the Berkeley K debates. Not a sense of accomplishment because the affirmation the app is good. There's no impact to this subjectivity stuff. There's literally it's not true. They certain black radical tradition, faithful cultures of spiritual justice studies allow for things like police protest, CGR, etc. Blaming other people like friends or family for having counter differences, spaces violent, and how lots of these laws to shift the blame from other things, which is obviously problematic. Small schools have publicly set violence to hold black leaders responsible for the violence of big schools like MBA or GBN, which is obviously pathology. And the DSRB emits literally at the bottom says they cause reflection and sustaining environmental household difference, which is the only currency, which means they internalize those things in the first place.
Okay, we have 4 check out. Is that right? Hold the line for the words you heard and floated the whatever. They have not extended for certain pieces of evidence or warrants and clearly have not made comparative claims or the warrants of their evidence compared to theirs. You do not give them any new explanation or leeway in the two for anything you do not have on the one year. There are two arguments we need to win to make fairness and claim done. First is that they cannot solve capitalist crises or access any impact. One is drop. Thesis level claim that a B is an inherently antagonistic activity. Debaters or competitors and judges do not take arguments from round. Just proves any solvency for an impact of futility. Anti-black racism in debate is produced by confluence of factors not single, and that nothing a single valve could solve. Second is that to the last capitalism, neo-Nazis are revolution or disproportionate. See also the negativity, they obviously can do that and win. Doesn't take subjectivity. Second, political hope is good and therefore it's possible going for it because on 1% versus this often sees the TVA auto solves. First, it's like evidence cycle while anti-blackness is never the same and machinery reduces balance. Sleeper, Jim Crow, and Nazi persecution are not the same. It's dropped and wasn't out of context, which means you should not protect your argument. Second is every Sullivan indict studies through political optimism has been beneficial effects for quality of life. Telling every black American the government can never do anything good is totally wrong. We don't need to win a lot of offense because theories aren't predicted. The 1,000th team before might not have done anything for the next one, but that's the reason why the TVA is solved to break the cycle. Now, framers, it's try or die to preserve the next living page with Gardner's offense against the app. Only an equitable grounded 7% per solution makes the TV workable and avoids the terminal impacts of topicality. Burnout to mix research and creativity and sustain the last of the game. It doesn't matter how small the impact is because it's the only thing that implicates are valid. There are three framing issues. One is that you should presume draft outcomes are false. They offer new for outcome for testing them as for our internal links, which is dropped out of the 1 ER. Second is a valid case. You can agree with all of the outcomes of the night because the only thing it achieves is to make a decision in a random round robin debate to remedy procedural interference. Reading arguments on the night is sufficient to solve the DFB evidence insofar that it achieves our research patterns. Third is dropped. Individual debates do not change anything. People internalize else as technical theorists. It is not a reason why their argument is bad or means to learn another person's view, which is a presumption argument that disproves any intrinsic benefit to their model. The 1 ER went for everything, so basically the way for nothing. You should allow the two there to blow up the arguments. The first argument, I'm going to start the TVA here because it solves the rest of the offense on the flow. The USFT could abolish polluting prisons or establish a valid PTD. They access the discussions of the same impact that are flagged in the 2EC overview. Slow down, equal managerialism, and black fungibility. Their 1EC evidence is that the water mismanagement disproportionately harms black communities, and so does the 1 ER dropped Williams evidence. The TVA can be paired with a discussion of politics outside the state, like fugitivity, which is the dropped Newman evidence, and the Vernier evidence, which says that grassroots movements could urge the government to work with them, which is the Everglades example that's in process. They dropped several fairness internal links, which are distant to their counter-interpretation. First is limit for a zero single definition of ecology or production under the model. You should interpret that as including any topic loosely related to a solution, which has three implications to turn the case. Second, first is that we cannot learn anything from the 1AC process. You should cross-apply the primary standard from the switch side debate. Basic psychology proves that if individuals are overburdened by massive number of affirmatives, they cannot do the research necessary to engage it or process their scholarship. B is that teams like T-Box do not engage in their methods, which is the solvency ego. C is that they don't solve their offense because policy still exists, including ones that are barely related to topic, which means that all the analysis that they do that's defense of fairness is actually just defense to them. Second, they drop the ground standard. There's nothing that unifies their versus the topic like USFT or production unifies ours, which answers all their infinite policy arguments. Third is fake advocacy and truism. The 1AC was non-controversial. If debate does take sensitivity, then isn't in here. It is a reason for you to vote negative because they would teach us bad skills. Now, the role of the ballot argument, they basically dropped all of the answers to this. First is that voting affirmative does not indict yourself to create fugitive species because you're going to go on and vote for a policy academically that their model says is bad because of the structure of debate. Second is that fugitive species can be formed by other things, going to tournaments, talking to people, reading books, etc. Their evidence does not contain a combination keyword. Third is that the connecting structure of fitness is bad because it makes sound flexible, which was also dropped. The role of the judge is to vote for the team that does the ballot debating. The role about it is to communicate that to tavern. Now, the line to line, they see use to protect black people. That's obviously solved with the CDA and the services, why they cannot be protected by reading policy arguments. They say to be psychology against the counter-interpretation above. They say that they meet the third means the resolution. No, they are not. They have not counter-interpreted the words UFFT or protection in the planet, so only we have a definition of those after the earth evidence and the moon evidence. They say that the fungibility that was dropped. No, it wasn't. You dropped the Newman evidence, which is obviously possible. People can engage with the sea, and that does not mean that people can engage with the sea, and that's not sort of a force that it does not give it legitimacy. And they've also conceded that there's no reason why they meet requires more labor for you to read a policy app than a KF, and all of our offense and defense on case breaks like well, they say that's inevitable, it doesn't matter because you really solve the impact from this debate. They say natural limits law. No, they did not. They dropped this stuff from the internal labor that I did that says there's no clear advocacy in the one is which guarantees that there will always be a permutation against any advocacy. Concessionary ground is bad. I learned that we had it in the water routine. You should cross it off your flow. They say the infinite ground is already allowed. No, it's not. It's checked by words in the resolution. They say that the TVA doesn't solve. Yes, it does. Yeah, the prison TVA is not extra topical, and it's not silenced because I did that analysis above. They say black success is at an all-time low. If not, it can be achieved by policy assets above. Fairness is neutral because it's good for everyone. All the rest of the stuff is answered above because I messed up the sorry.
Right. Case group. Is anyone not good? Are Our theory of power means you cannot vote negative procedural fairness because we witness an economic justice tendency that undergirds how we debate over the process of monitoring and managing water quality. We impact on the original competition, the formal constraints entailed by procedural fairness, and limits and collapse, relationization, surveillance, and discourse rubric, undergirding substantivity debate is the affective experiential traits of a game-based model of competition, flat, humanity, comparing the better disciplines, the ancient unruly minds to uncritically replicate the same patterns of procedural fairness and education without interrogation of the formal elements, formal practice, conformally conditioned and shape the epicenter products of advocacy, predictive class, which is conceptual, in the McCurry, talks about how institutional recognition is always used and deployed as a way to further mystify the exploitation that ensues, which is materializing the examples that the evidence, the two and the block had defense to it, but the two are did not extend an answer to it proper, which means you can't weigh their defense. The next articulated the intrinsic value of fairness in the context of their content of debate. They've only stopped some revision, resolution, content, regardless of their interpretation, which we have impact on because we've said that debates over that growth process are terminally anti-black and never do anything for black subsidy and agency go out because they're the only ones engaging in interrogating the rubrics of political legibility. The two are the presumption argument doesn't make any sense because they didn't make an argument for why we don't solve. They dropped the attacking 1 AR cross-up from the link turn on the cap about black fugitivity planning literally spilling up and solving extinction. Debate isn't antagonist, but should be viewed ecologically. Should be viewed ecologically, even if it is. They dropped that fugitivity itself can produce black agency. That was the sojourner evidence in the 20C that allows for black fugitive practices to spill outside of debate, which proves that debate can shape substantivity. That is carded evidence that they don't have counter evidence to drop 1 AR judge instruction or filtering all legal questions to McCurry, Milligan, and paradigms of institutional action representation are false equivalents of justice in Atlanta proves the toxic flow of resources ceases the wheels of liberalism, turn out the APA guidelines and regulatory procedures. The violence of racial integration is inextricable to the procedure-driven language of liberal reformism and resiliency, which they have defended, but not in a great way. Reaffirming state purpose, community, family, belonging, that advocacy weaponized against black communities, the framework to be the role of the judge, and to affirm fugitive space of education. The tiebreakers that we have a card and they don't. The future politics central for black survival in this space that is a recognition of the importance of protecting black students and community members, given the nature of the lack of black success in this space, which is proven by there being one black debater at this round, which goes dropped by the negative. Their only responsibility makes zero sense. They're just like, you can read with the policy. I have made a choice to read this for the key. If they have denied me that choice, you should vote them down for pathology and ethicality. They should not determine how black people engage in this space, given a lack of black success in this space, that they drop their role to judge anti-black because it evaluates all argument with equal weight, which reduces the severity or impacts. They can never understand the particular black experience of derelict in this space. Colin Ward turns their defense. You can only ensure that they have a confrontative, they confront our offense in this space. Their only argument is that, you can educate outside of space. The only insurance of education and confrontation that they must engage with futility is in this space, which you should hold them accountable for. The defense proper, we need goes dropped by the two in our pathologies, uniqueness, black success, force, not valid reasonability because our success remains in the resolution. Their only response is that we don't defend the USFG, which we have already impacted on above, especially given our historical. Given our specific historical consideration of how water policies have negatively affected black communities in places like Atlanta and Washington near the Anacostia River, where the EPA officials in the area have overlooked the nature of degradation of black communities and increased exploitation in those areas. And both pieces of evidence we draw from this have a connection on how fugitivity resolve those misconceptions, which proves that our research doesn't run away from engagement or results in order to say anti-black is undergirds beliefs, politicians, actors, overdetermines how we understand the political sphere in the first place, which turns the TVA because it's a sequencing argument of the way our discourse is used and justified the way we orient ourselves to politics in the first place, which the TVA obviously can't solve. I'll go there now. One, they dropped the timelines based on making politics with foreclosed intimacy and makes the debate about a 5-second plan text that never resolves around fugitivity. The threshold is on them to prove they even solve 1%. Obviously, they don't. Yet they say abolish presidents. They dropped this literally extra effective, which is because they can defend infinite things that have resulted in water protection. The PTD links to stuff much such that debate. They drop false promise paradigm. The just make fair against us on the negative way. Infinite magnitude impacts against K, which makes critical negation impossible. They also dropped that they don't solve their offense. Already infinite background on the topic that are being used by big team that spam tiny water protection as the script just had unique links and process conflicts that don't solve, which is worse for small schools. They could have engaged us. They case of liberal recognition, visibility, archiving, historical memory, case conclusion. But the reason they didn't is because they have a pathological encounter with blackness in this scholarship that must be confronted. The no subject formation is non-charter. There's no tuner or the history of black African tradition, debate, political, cultural, and spiritual discussion. Last for community organizing right here, like police force, SCR, etc. People like people like Musa Feli said, empowered by black debate communities or getting material forms of change proves that they the ballot pick. They drop the SRB. That proves that balance is good for holding teams accountable, cause reflection, environmental hostage diversity. It's the only currency. It's empirically supported for the success of things like Louisville United Council. That's the birth of increasing value to community trends. Now the fairness debate proper. They already dropped black success and all-time low because the anti-black climate debate was the framing issue that proves mythology outweighs all their offers. They answered to strong members in the block, but they had no answer to it in the 2 and R. So carded piece of evidence that outweighs all their arguments because they presume neutral states to rest on procedural terms of debate that assume a universality towards the accessibility towards how we debate, which creates a white hegemony that allows them to cycle through what they presume as a fruitful engagement, what they presume as ability to clash, what they presume is viable. This is actively pathological, given the nature of the lack of black success and the lack of black people to speak up for the issues that we are contextualizing and talking about in this space. You should prioritize
outside universal structural fairness because we have a specific impact to that was just not that was just dropped by the tune. Our filters are off because what's the benefit of sustaining this activity? Pathologize black participants is psychologically violent to participants in this space, which generates the impact of black pathology. They consider the distinction between equality and equity, where black debaters have to work twice as hard to prove arguments. Fairness isn't intrinsic good because they're pathological.
Hey y'all, we there's a debate on this,
I voted down.
No, we do our 2 hours and 1 hour.
Everyone? Alright, thank you everyone for attending our Big Red Round Robin, or BRR as I've been hearing it called all weekend. The winner of the final round is a 2-1 for the negative from Lawrence Free State.
All right, I sat. I think that the AF wins on the case debate that sort of fugitive struggles or attempts are more productive at achieving change than sort of like working through the state to achieve them. The McCreary and Milligan evidence, I think, is pretty good about the empirical example about Atlanta and the EPA, about how it was only when there were attempts to sort of like thwart and circumvent that real like attempts to create change were ever made. It's pretty good. And I have some like troubles with like a lot of the stuff. I think that AF does a good job of characterizing how a lot of the evidence that's being put forth from the negative about why sort of like attempts to create change don't necessarily speak to like working through the state. Like they're just kind of like hope good arguments, which I don't think the AF is like a super pessimistic like hope bad argument. And in fact, the AF is kind of like, this is a better strategy for achieving change, not like change is impossible type strategy. Then on the framework debate, I think that the negative definitely wins a fairness argument. It's just a question of whether or not I think the sort of like inclusion arguments that they win sort of outweigh those fairness arguments. I don't think that you win the TVA argument. Like one, I think if they win their arguments on case, that means that like one, just the TVA can't solve. And then two, they're like the like, is it topical? Is it not topical? Is super shallow on both sides. Like there's pretty much just an assertion. Like if I just like gut check, is abolition of prisons water protection? No, like no, it's not. So like I'm willing to say it's extra topical to abolish prisons on this topic. And so I think that it doesn't even meet sort of like the burden that the negative would put forward as to what would have to be necessary to do that. Once I think that sort of they get access to their inclusions, there's not really a space in the interpretation that the negative puts forth for that, then sort of those inclusion arguments trigger to outweigh fairness. I think that there could be a little bit more done to insulate yourself from some of this stuff, like maybe some truth testing arguments, things like that, to prevent the sort of like cross application of case to the fairness debate. But I don't think that was occurring here. And so that even though I think that you're winning some pretty standard arguments that yes, the AF is unfair to the negative, that's just not sufficient to warrant a negative out.
Yeah, I can go next. So the nexus question for me was, can the TVA capture the intent and impact of Black fugitivity? And I think there's a consistent push throughout the AF speeches that the affirmative is the only one with evidence describing the process and content of fugitivity, and the negative characterization is that grassroots movements referenced in the Mario evidence could embrace an ethic of fugitivity while partnering with the federal government to address many of the examples the AF illustrates, including Flint, Atlanta, etc. My issue with the AF here is that while you say the TVA must be compatible with fugitivity and that the USFG cannot implement it, there's a disconnect in the mechanism of grassroots movements partnered with the USFG. I do think there's ample opportunity for why the partnership with the USFG would nullify the fugitivity of the movement, but I do not have that captured and emphasized in the 1AR and highlighted in the 2AR beyond the top line answer. I spent a lot of time really going through the McCreary and Amelski evidence about racialized surveillance and the dream of elsewhere embedded within activist causes aligned to USFG changes, at least a sufficient internal link access into their scholarship, especially when they've given the hedging around the lens of sufficiency rather than 100% solvency for a TVA. I also think there's a big piece of neg offense against the counterinterp, namely the limits explosion because of germane to the topic, without an intention to exclude and would unlimit with a proliferation of fringe apps, which catalyzes the fairness impact through a need for stasis and kind of supercharges their access to that. The argument that gave me the most pause was Black participation, especially in tandem with the neg's kind kind of flippant approach to the debate as a game question. I think the NEC absolutely needed to devote more time and attention to grappling with the nuance here, and that the response really is a defense of the resolution that's equally accessible to all debaters, and that the fairness predicated off of the resolutional stasis enhances access universally. But what tipped it for the NEC for me was the offense to the counterinterpreting regarding the unlimited nature of the standards winding to the scale of the topic. Earlier in the debate, the app had good defense of the claims. For example, you can read optimism versus pessimism, but those threads weren't pulled through the duration of the debate to make it to the final rebuttals. And ultimately, I think that offense is resolved if I think the NEC has some access into fugitivity through the grassroots activism aligned to the TBA, especially with the addition of switch side debate into the topical versions. So that just leaves the ballot key role of the judge arguments to resolve, and I think that with access to the solvency outside the round, which even the DSRB evidence says that balanced internally to attention and prioritization, not material spillover outside the debate, it becomes a question of whether or not the scholarship endorsed by the ballot meaningfully impacts community-based practices, which again I think is shaped by the NEC's access to their interpretation.
Yeah, I agree a lot with what Liliana said. I want to focus on the last part, the kind of ballot mechanics of absolvency stuff. I think the 1AR is suffering from an attempt to extend just like too much stuff, and you're not just like not getting the depth that I want out of a lot of the warrants I'm looking for. I think the 2AR moves in a decent and interesting direction by sitting on the kind of like uniqueness question of the state of debate, its relationship to blackness, but I'm missing this big question earlier in the debate and some kind of coherent big impact to it as described in comparison to what the NEC's doing, right? I think the 2AR is rhetorically appealing, but this is out in describing the mechanics of the ballot and specifically the way the app operates. I think you're just kind of like assuming we're going to go read the evidence and assuming that we understand the mechanics of like black hair debate, etc. One frustrating thing is that you begin targeting moments like the DSRB evidence, for example, but you would never explain it beyond a kind of like, this means we research and force them to research and connect, but I just don't have a way to judge if that's true and verify if that is continued on kind of in future debates, yada, yada. I think the NEC does a good job framing the ballot, not just in the sense of discussing the kind of spillover claims and describing the round-around kind of dissociation that occurs, but in that the reasons debate, it has an anti-blackness shade to it, are things outside of the scope of a balloted decision, and you don't kind of ever address how that those things can be touched by your spillover claims. I think this is where I want to see more, especially at the point that there's assuredly something to this like big uniqueness you have in the 2AR that the NEC doesn't have a great answer to, right? I want a better explanation of multiple mechanisms of the app, right? There are a lot of claims of spillover, but if black debaters succeed in the unique space, right? What does it mean if you, as the only black debater at this round robin, wins? What does it mean? For resolution with dissent, non-topical advocacy, etc. Does that bring people in? Does it need to bring people in? Does it create some sort of signal that brings people in? Do you have to win that or to win the ballot? I just have a bunch of questions that are never really answered regarding the way the ballot shapes people in the context of voting affirmative. I think this is also a point where more planless teams need to start crafting offense. I've been thinking about this as I'm watching debates, but it's so easy for the NEC to say like the ballot resolves procedural fairness concerns, but there were some interesting moments of like you saying like, no, teams will always stretch norms and you're blaming us for that behavior. I think that's like a cool piece of offense that should have been the centerpiece of the 2AR because I just don't have that argument answered in the 2NR. And I want to see it develop, not just in like moments of cross-examination too. Another argument is that this idea that judges become deputies of fairness. I have that kind of starred after the 2AR, but which I don't think has ever like an internal link or impact explained to it, as in like, what is our goal other than to evaluate the winner as a judge to evaluate the winner and loser of a single round? What is that idea that we gatekeep do beyond evaluating this single debate? Even if I think that you as individuals are influenced by the things you read in research, I'm unsure about the spillover claim about how judges will use this as a weapon to dissent against like black debaters' ideas, etc. So I'm just missing the kind of like depth of spillover and also the internal impacts.
Can I just ask you one question, Austin? Unless you're the series of questions you asked at the beginning, why is that burden on the affirmative if I'm not hearing the negative ask those same questions in the 2NR?
The NEC has made a claim that they are able to resolve their offense. I think it's a question of you able to resolve your offense.
Okay.
And I think like the 1AR and the 2AR is letting it get away with too much of just like the ballot doesn't do anything besides determine winner and loser. I need a further explanation of what the significance of, like, what does it mean if we vote for him in this moment?
Thanks.
I have a couple of questions. I guess more so for Liliana. The negative concedes an impact to the vision of competition and the way in which debating over the content of the amendment and monitoring the water quality is bad. It creates a game-based model of competition that flattens the humanity of competitors, disciplines the agency of the unwitting minds to uncritically replicate the same paradigms of procedural fairness that we have isolated as bad, that the content under their resolution is anti-black and produces bad modes of action. There's no 2-hour response. The block doesn't put defense on their topics, so I'm confused. One, why they get the TVA, given that we have an impact turn to the debates around the resolution of questions that they have said is valuable.
Yeah, I think two things. In the question of the interpretation, there's offense to yours as well. So in the world of competing interpretations, it's not just their interp that has offense associated, but also they have offense aligned to your interpretation. So it's weighing and balancing the interaction between the two of those. And if that level of germane to the resolution versus a defense of the resolution in tandem with movements aligned to and associated with it, I think that's the question rather than yes, no access to resolution debate, if that answers that first part of your question.
Well, I guess why is competing interpretations a filter for how you evaluate the TVA? Like the TVA is like the question of whether or not their content can solve ours. We impact on that. I'm not sure. Like
yeah, the TVA is not a question of competing interpretations for me. It's that lens of sufficiency solvency, where they make the argument that the TVA doesn't have to encapsulate 100% of the affirmative, but rather show access to the body of scholarship identified and drawn from in the 1AC. And if there's a reason that I can believe the TVs that they presented could reasonably draw from that same body of scholarship and the pool pulled from in the 1AC, then there's a reason how that could be pulled through and used in a topical version aligned to debate around the resolution. But I agree with you, a bigger part of the 1AR and 2AR had been how the resolution in and of itself and any association or affiliation with it has unique offensive impacts for even the defense of it in a round beyond the switch side questions, then that needs to be a bigger part of the affirmative speeches in order to be a piece of offense that I can vote on.
Let's go to the affirmative debate proper. I don't hear anyone's RFP like the leading personality offensive right after the winning judge argument. That's just like those dropouts going on outside of an argument that all USFG means that we said that like our discussions are germane to the resolution given the specific historical considerations that the app has taken into account of like the way policies impact black communities and utilities is a necessary starting point to resolve those modes of exploitation that allows us to understand the way politicians and political structures act, which overdetermines like the modes of exploitation that exist and like the common shared experience of black people at the level of ecological disaster, which is a reasonability ballot that goes drop out of negative. I'm not sure like, how you evaluate this, but at the level of defense and prioritization, like because I use it to prioritize our pathology offense. It's like we have defense to their interpretation regardless of competing interpretation, which means like you should defer at the level versus capitals. So
I would disagree that the neg dropped it because I do think there was contextualization for how the both switch side aspects and TVA could engage with the examples you listed, and then both the 2NC and 2NR went through a lot of the examples from the app evidence, like Flint, Atlanta, etc., Katrina, and explained that that was something that could be engaged, and those could be examples of topical affirmatives that address that, or at least the ones that are still around today. So I disagree that it was dropped completely, but I also think that there is that historical aspect of engaging with how the communities worked in the past, but I don't see how that is incompatible with the resolutional defense.
I don't think even I would have given you credit for that weak argument. Like they're clearly weighing a violation that being USFG is necessary to achieve the ground and the predictability and stuff like that. Like that your interp isn't good enough to get you where you need to be.
Yeah, I guess for just a Google app, what's the necessary explanation there are for outweighing mythology over fairness in the context of a set of some
Can you say that one more time? The door was slamming.
for everyone that didn't go first, what's the 2AR explanation that you needed for pathology outweighs fairness in the context of the set of strong evidence?
For me, I think it's a double down on what the ballot does. So taking the last two parts of the 1AC, the DSRB and the one that started with a B, I forget the exact name, and really sitting on those two and explaining how in this moment, in this debate, the action of the affirmative is valuable for you and for other debaters, for those watching on the live stream, for those watching in the audience, for the symbolic value to winning, something that is tangible and tied to the ballot, something that does link into the offense that's explained throughout your evidence, both the material outside of the debate, but also the significance of this one, how winning and getting that, the value that comes from that and the attention of people looking, reading, prepping, etc., going into different speeches or going into different tournaments, all of that being an external piece of offense that you have intrinsic to the ballot and to this debate. And then a lot of what you're getting in terms of what he was saying earlier about there are other aspects of debate that are unfair, but K teams and in particular Black debaters are the ones who are targeted and blamed for that unfairness that's structural to the activity overall, and other examples of that.
I think also, although the 2NR never says the word like falsifiability, there's a big moment where she pushes this idea that it's not just a question of what the ballot does for me, it is the meaningful, about what kind of impacts we can evaluate within debate as a structure. So the things like the pathology examples and the pathology impact, I don't know how we falsify those. I don't know how we compare those to things like a tangible, ballot question of was this debate strategically maximized, whatever, or one side. So I think it's also, you need to push this idea of just like, you should double down if we tell you that things are messed up and they're like, vision is messed up, you should believe less kind
I'm sorry, I have a brief follow-up here. Austin, for your answer to Kevin specifically, you brought out the kind of internal link questions that motivated your ballot. Was it the absence of internals, or was it the absence of a contextualization for internal links to the ballot?
I don't know the huge distinction between those, but I think it is the question more in the context of the ballot. Okay, what it does here. I mean, because the 2AR was so focused, and I think far more focused than the 1AR was on what he symbolizes in this space, right? And I don't want to talk like it's like not right there, right?
No.
But you're discussing this as like how you act in the space, right? And what it means to vote for you. I want to hear more of that in the context of what that ballot means and does.
I guess, like the role of the judge, I think I did that on the role of the judge portion. Maybe I could have been more explicit, but I was just like, it's necessary to like affirm inclusion of politics for Black survivability, given the lack of Black participants to speak up for these issues, and a recognition of like the importance of protecting Black students and community members in the context of the discourse that they wish to protect.
Sure, and I don't know what voting after does for like Black survivability. I guess it's not a good question.
Well, I guess like that would be the solvency question in case like fugitivity produces the possibility for Black survivability, and then like given that the Cold War is in the context of Black fugitivity and the act, if we win that, if our mode of engaging the space is ethical and provides the possibility for racial counter spaces and reducing anti-Black racial terror in this space, then that was kind of the ballot that or what the ballot does kind of question that I was looking for.
Right, and also to
I'm missing.
like add on to like I guess the examples that were given in the 1A and the 2A about how like the historical success of things like Louisville, like Rutgers, etc., which has been substantiated by the bottom of the DSRB card that talks about how like ballots cause reflection on environmental school difference.
Yeah.
Would that be like the warrant for why the ballots keep the bucks in the
Sure. Yeah, this is all good, and I would desire more in the 1A and the 2A, because I think those explanations of how that functions is missing.
Okay.
I think you had step one, but you need to bring it home. So why feasibility? Why this app? Why don't they get access to it through NEG or other versions of critical apps? Why is this one particularly necessary? Why this debate? Why is this round robin forum, auditorium setting stage of a debate that has attention? Why is high school debate valuable insofar compared to a college debate as something that has significance? So if you pull it through and tie it with a bow of not just the beginning, but really complete the argument.
What do you think the negative said to meet that threshold of explanation for that? It seems like that's a pretty.
Yeah, I guess because like I feel like the biggest 2NR push was like the whole like competitive and like why the competitive nature of debate is key. So then I guess what is the whole like explanation of why we need to explain why the round robin forum, why debate, why high school debate.
Sure, that push is why I think that the individual ballot can judge whether or not this debate should have happened from a topical standpoint.
Can you rephrase that?
They have made a judgment through T that this debate was imbalanced, and that we know that using the ballot to say that it was imbalanced is good enough to acknowledge that. Their threshold for, this is like the trick of framework, right? Their threshold for solving their impacts are extraordinarily low.
Do you have any like ideas for maybe how we can make it more clear for allocating those?
I mean, the warrants are pulling out from like the DSRB stuff. I want to hear more just materially, what does it mean to vote half? What does that do, right? I'm hearing the word spill up a lot. I just don't have any context for what that means, what that looks like.
Good deal.
Great round of
Good.
I might be doing something later.
Yeah, I have a question, but I don't really want to make everyone stay, so it's fine.
I got a question, answer the question.